A little bit earlier on. We now move to another story. The funeral service of veteran journalist Raymond Louw and his wife Jean is currently underway at the St. Columbus Church in Parkview in Johannesburg. The couple died last week, just hours apart. 92-year-old Raymond Louw was a media freedom activist and later Deputy Chairperson of the South African Press Council. Let's go now and join our reporter Gillian Pillay, who's been watching the funeral. Let's find out what's happening now. Gillian, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Has the funeral finished? What's been happening?
A very good afternoon to you, Peter. Yes, the funeral service has ended, but it was more a celebration of life that we saw playing out here at this Presbyterian church. A lot of journalists who had gone through the ranks, who had worked alongside Raymond, had converged on this particular, for a lack of a better word, a memorial service. But I think Anton Harbour, who was also working alongside Ray at the time, as he was called, had really paid justice to the legacy this man had left behind. He had spoken of a man who was a journalist of journalists and editor of editors, who had worked himself through the ranks, who had started right at the bottom in the industry, a man who had brought the first black reporters and photographers into the newsroom. He spoke about, the role he played in Peter Magubani's life, the veteran photographer, and how, relentlessly Louw had fought the segregation laws, but also a man who had a spine, who stood by his principles, who had later gone on to fight for freedom of expression. And for any journalist, myself included, having sat in these benches listening to such a rich legacy of a wife, Jean, who stood alongside her husband, who had supported him, who within their family had started a whole little newspaper, and they got their children involved. It really resonated with journalists, and asking the question, what kind of legacy would you leave behind? Have you done enough when you're doing your stories? And are you principled in the way you churn out your stories? I think that was the message that resonated with a lot of veteran journalists here today, but also up-and-coming and aspiring journalists. Just to go through some of the detail that Anton had shared with the congregation here, he said that Louw was a determined activist. He was a man who never gave up, who always had energy to go on despite everyone else having, being tired by the fight and the struggle to better the lives, or also to tell the story of during the height of apartheid. They found that Louw had just, he had this relentless and remarkable spirit, an impeccable man, but also a gentleman, someone who never lost his cool, but always was very respectful of his peers, but also his people who worked underneath him. Just to reflect on some more detail there, a self-made, self-taught journalist. That is what Anton Harbour said of Louw. Also, he said, he was a hard newsman. He had an instinct for news and breaking news and hard news. And during that time, the newspaper that Louw had headed was very profitable, but also very factual, and did stand by the principles of the kinds of stories that they churned out during that time, particularly against the apartheid regime. We saw Louw just, standing by his journalists and getting those kinds of stories out there, Peter.
Gillian, I guess a man who died with so many years, a senior, there's so many people that he mentored, I guess, and I'm sure the pews must have been full of people of different generations that have been affected by him one way or another.
No, definitely, Peter. We saw a lot of people who had worked alongside him, a lot of people who he had influenced. You will remember that he sat on many committees, but also wrote many opinion pieces and, pushed for freedom of expression. He was the founding, if we can call him the founding father, with SANEF, but also with the Freedom of Expression Institute. And that was the kind of caliber of people who poured out into this church today to, bid farewell. But as I said, a celebration of life. It wasn't really a funeral service in the word as one would know it, Peter. It was a few people who had come up to talk about their relationship and the influence that this couple had on their lives. Their children took to the podium, and it was really warm, and you could tell that this was a very close-knit family, and that particular void will take forever, if ever, to fill. And that is what they would miss about their parents, really kindred spirits who would have celebrated 70 years together, Peter. And look at how they left, almost like kindred spirits, hours apart. And that was the kind of, speech and kind of dialogue and sharing of love and affection that we saw pouring out from those speakers. But really, Anton Harbour did justice to the legacy of Louw. Very few speakers, though, Peter, took to the podium. And as I said, a celebration more than a funeral service that we saw here today, talking about that kind of mark that was left, also what we have lost, but also what we can reflect on and where to from here. Who should pick up that baton from Louw to continue what he has started and left behind, Peter.
Gillian, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very, very much indeed. That's our reporter, Gillian Pillay, at the funeral service that's just concluded of veteran journalist Raymond Louw, who died a short while ago with his wife, Jean, just hours apart. And that was all taking place in Parkview in Johannesburg.